Welcome back to Turtle Island Tales. Tonight we plunge into the high-stakes, strategic world of the winter hunter. Picture the vast, unbroken silence of a North American winter, a land of hidden traps and frozen dangers. For the people who called this continent home, the cold was a merciless adversary, and the search for food became a perfect fusion of spiritual reverence and ruthless efficiency. How did a hunter, without modern rifles or reconnaissance, locate and take down a massive buffalo or moose when the world was covered in deep snow? What were the ingenious techniques, from specialized snowshoes to communal drives, that turned a freezing disadvantage into a life-saving opportunity? Join us as we uncover the secrets of the strategic winter hunt, a masterclass in survival where every track, every wind current, and every piece of specialized gear was part of a meticulously planned victory over the brutal season. Part 1. The Preparatory Calculus. Anticipating the famine. The strategic winter hunt began not with a kill, but with a profound, almost ritualistic preparation that involved every member of the community. Survival was a logistics problem solved in the months of plenty, long before the land locked down in ice. The autumnal inventory and tally. In the late fall, before the major snowfalls, the hunt chiefs, often advised by the women who were the keepers of the food caches, performed a rigorous inventory. Every container of dried corn, every rawhide bag of berries, and every bundle of processed jerky was counted and tallied. This final count was the foundational strategic document, determining precisely how many buffalo, moose, or caribou were required to carry the community through the next 4 to 5 moons. This was not guesswork. It was a high-stakes census of survival. If the caches were thin, the hunt had to be large-scale and immediate. If the stores were adequate, the winter hunt could be smaller, focusing on smaller game to conserve energy and expose fewer hunters to danger. Weaponry and the cold weather check. Winter conditions posed a unique threat to the tools of the hunt. Bows, often crafted from ash, hickory, or horn, were susceptible to shattering in extreme brittle cold. The hunters meticulously oiled their bows with animal grease, a process that slightly increased the wood's elasticity and reduced the chance of a catastrophic snap under tension. The bowstrings, made of sinew or hide, were constantly checked for dampness, as a wet string would stretch, freeze, and become useless. Hunters carried spare, pre-warmed sinew close to their bodies for emergency field repairs. Arrowhead integrity. Arrowheads of flint, obsidian, or bone were not just secured with pitch. They were sometimes tied with fine, dry sinew that was coated in a light layer of tallow. This coating prevented the sinew from absorbing moisture, ensuring the arrowhead remained firmly affixed after impacting the thick, dense winter coat of large game. The quiver's role. The quiver, often made of durable hide, was designed not just for transport, but for protection. It sealed the arrows against snow and moisture, acting as a microenvironment to keep the fletching, feathers, and points dry, a critical detail, as wet feathers would destabilize the arrow's flight and waste a precious shot. The medicine of the weapon, plains northeast. Preparation was incomplete without the spiritual dimension. For tribes across the plains, like the Lakota and Crow, the weapons were ritually prepared. Before the hunt, the weapons might be passed through the fragrant, cleansing smoke of cedar or sage, smudging, a prayer asking for the animal to offer itself up for the community's life. This spiritual pact was essential. The hunter sought the animal's willing sacrifice, not just its death, which ensured the hunter approached the task with respect and focus, a psychological readiness as vital as any sharp point. Part 2. The Silent Library. Tracking in the snow and ice, the snow, which appeared to erase the world, was, to the Native American hunter, an open book. Tracking in the winter was a specialized science that required deep knowledge of animal behavior and the subtle language of the frozen earth. Reading the depth and pattern, plains forests. Hunter learned to read not just the shape of a track, but its depth and the surrounding snow disturbance. Deep tracks indicated a large, heavy animal, buffalo, moose, that was expending significant energy, making it potentially easier to corner or exhaust. The hunter knew that a moose sinking to its belly in a drift was a moose that could be overtaken. The drag mark, a slight drag mark between hoof prints, particularly for deer or moose, could indicate an animal that was exhausted, wounded, or struggling in deep powder, a signal to increase the pace of the pursuit. If the drag was erratic, it might signal an animal in distress or panic. The scent of fear. Hunters learned to identify the subtle shift in air current and scent that signaled an animal was moving from grazing to agitation. The cold air, while suppressing scent dispersal, made any strong odor, like the musk of an elk, hang low and travel along the contours of the land. The snow goggle necessity, Blackfoot adaptation. On the bright, reflective plains, snow blindness was a severe and sudden threat that could end a hunt and endanger a life. The Blackfoot and other northern tribes utilized primitive snow goggles, small pieces of wood, bone, or caribou antler carved with narrow horizontal slits. Tied over the eyes with sinew, these slits drastically reduced the amount of blinding glare reflected from the snow surface, protecting the hunter's vision for hours of continuous tracking. This simple, ingenious technology was a vital piece of the winter medical kit, ensuring the hunter could maintain his sight and avoid debilitating pain. Reading the wind and terrain. The hunter's most important tool was the wind. The approach was always made upwind, ensuring the hunter's scent was carried away from the animal. However, the hunter also read the wind's strength to predict the animal's location. Dense forest. On days of light wind, deer or elk would often graze out in open clearings. High wind. When gales howled, animals would seek immediate shelter in the thickest brush or downwind side of ridges, which is where the hunters focused their search. The terrain itself became a predictor of animal behavior. Part 3. Specialized hunting tactics for the cold. The cold transformed hunting from a chase into a strategic ambush, relying on the environment to slow and isolate the prey. Different tribes developed techniques perfectly suited to their specific landscapes. The buffalo jump, plains, Blackfoot, crow. The most spectacular and resource-intensive strategy was the buffalo jump, used primarily in the late fall or early winter when the snow began to accumulate. This was a massive communal hunt that required perfect coordination. The drive, hunters, sometimes disguised in wolf or buffalo calf skins, would use shouts, waving hides, and fire to gently drive a large buffalo herd toward a pre-scouted cliff or steep drop-off. The animal skins were used for disguise and to mimic the herd's natural environment, allowing the hunters to get closer without causing panic too early. The stampede. Near the edge, the tempo would dramatically increase, turning the drive into a chaotic stampede. The first buffalo would be forced over the edge, and the dense following mass would be unable to stop, plunging to their deaths or injury below. The scale. Sites like head-smashed-in buffalo jump are historical monuments to this strategic, large-scale engineering of the hunt, yielding an immense, immediate harvest of meat and hides, often enough to provision the entire camp for the full winter. The snowshoe advantage. Northeast, Algonquin, Cree. In the deep, powdery snow of the northeast forests, large game like moose and elk struggled. The hunter, however, was equipped with snowshoes, crafted from ashwood frames laced with rawhide or sinew. The snowshoes distributed the hunter's weight across a wide area, allowing them to glide over the deep snow surface. This was a direct technological advantage. The moose, sinking deep into the powder, was quickly exhausted, enabling the hunter to close the distance and dispatch the slowed prey with a spear or bow. The hunt became a controlled exertion where the hunter's energy efficiency was key. The seal-breathing hole, Arctic, Inuit. The Inuit faced the unique challenge of hunting seals hidden beneath a massive sheet of sea ice. The technique, known as moliktuk, was a test of patience and acute sensory perception. The weight. The hunter would locate a seal breathing hole, aglu, often identified by a subtle change in the snow's texture or a small indentation. The hunter would then wait, motionless, sometimes for hours, enduring the frigid stillness. The hunter often wore white caribou hide clothing to blend perfectly with the environment, becoming an invisible part of the ice. The strike. When the seal surfaced for air, the hunter would plunge a harpoon, tipped with bone or metal, through the hole with lightning speed. This required absolute silence, immense patience, and the ability to distinguish the sound of the seal's breath from the crackling and groaning of the shifting ice. Part 4. The Hunt's End. The Zero Waste Doctrine. The moment the animal fell, the hunt shifted from an act of violence to a precise, respectful act of processing. The zero waste philosophy was a moral, spiritual, and medical imperative, ensuring that the animal's sacrifice sustained the community completely. The first cut and the blood offering, plains. Upon dispatching the buffalo, the hunter often performed a quick, precise cut to bleed the animal. The blood, rich in iron, was sometimes collected immediately and consumed, a high-energy, anti-scurvy drink in the cold. A small ritual might be performed, a prayer whispered, or a pinch of tobacco offered to the earth, thanking the animal's spirit for its gift and asking for forgiveness. The work immediately began to process the meat before the cold could set it, making the women's arrival at the site a critical logistical step. Processing for calorie density, the women's work. The women, often following the hunting party, took charge of the meticulous butchering. The goal was maximum calorie density for winter storage. Pemmican priority. The best cuts of lean meat were sliced thin and immediately hung on portable drying racks, often made of willow, to dry into jerky. The fat tallow was rendered separately. These two components were the essential ingredients for pemmican, the ultimate survival ration, which would be mixed with dried berries, like choke cherries, and packed into rawhide bags. Marrow. The large bones were cracked open immediately to extract the bone marrow. This buttery substance was a prized delicacy and a massive source of vital fats and nutrients, often consumed raw or boiled into broth to replenish the hunter's energy and warm their core immediately after the exertion of the hunt. The material harvest. Every non-food part was designated for survival gear, hide. The entire skin was carefully removed for teepee covers, winter robes, and bedding. The tanning process, again, was the work of women, transforming the raw material into flexible, functional architectural insulation. Bones, used for tools, awls, needles, and weapons. Sinew, dried and separated into threads for sewing hides and lashing tools. Bladder, stomach, cleaned and used as cooking pots, boiled with hot stones, or as waterproof storage containers for fat and pemmican. This immediate, methodical processing ensured that no part of the animal was lost to the cold, turning a single successful hunt into months of food, shelter, and clothing for the entire band. Part 5. The winter return. Transport and safety. Returning to the camp with the kill was often as dangerous as the hunt itself, requiring specialized transport and a keen sense of navigational safety. The travois, plains northeast. The primary transport method was the travois. The heavy poles, often the teepee poles themselves, were lashed together at one end and spread into a triangular frame. A platform of netting or hide was stretched between the poles to carry the heavy loads of meat and hides. Efficiency. The travois was a genius solution because, in winter, it glided effortlessly over the snow and ice, reducing the energy required for transport. Before the introduction of the horse, dogs pulled smaller travois, carrying vital supplies and sharing the load of the kill. The poles themselves, after transporting the meat, were immediately used to re-erect the teepee at the new campsite, fulfilling a dual architectural and logistical function. Navigation by the cosmos, the star that does not walk. Blizzards or heavy snowfall could rapidly obliterate all familiar landmarks. Native American hunters were masters of celestial navigation. The Lakota, for example, tracked the North Star, the star that does not walk, aligning their direction of travel with its fixed point in the sky. By night, the Big Dipper pointed to this star, and by day, they could track the arc of the sun, using the shadows it cast on the snow to maintain a true bearing back to camp, preventing the lethal disorientation of a whiteout. Emergency shelter. The snow cave. If a storm overwhelmed the hunting party, the immediate construction of an emergency snow shelter was mandated. Using a bone shovel or even a piece of wood, the hunters would rapidly dig a small cave or build a quinzee, a hollowed-out mound of snow. This shelter, relying on the insulating properties of the snow, immediately cut the wind and raised the internal temperature to a survivable level, buying the hunters critical hours until the storm passed. The ability to find shelter in the very element that threatened them was the final, Unwritten rule of the strategic winter hunt. Part 6. The unseen hunt, trapping and snaring. While large-scale hunts provided the bulk of the winter stores, smaller, consistent sources of protein were essential for maintaining the daily caloric needs of the camp, a task often managed by the elderly and the young. This unseen hunt relied on passive, ingenious methods that conserved human energy. The snare line, northeast forests. In the forests, a network of snare lines was essential. Made from strong sinew or specialized plant fibers, these simple loops were placed along known rabbit and fox trails. The snare was designed to tighten quickly around the animal's neck or leg as it ran along its habitual path. Energy efficiency. The genius of the snare was its efficiency. It required minimal human input, only checking the line once or twice a day, and posed no risk to the hunter. It provided a constant, low-level supply of high-protein meat and valuable furs, rabbit, fox for clothing and bedding, deadfalls and pit traps. For larger, but not massive, animals like beaver or wolverine, deadfalls were used. These were simple traps where a heavy log was propped up by a delicate, baited trigger mechanism. When the animal disturbed the bait, the log would fall, killing the animal instantly. Pit traps, concealed beneath layers of brush and snow, were sometimes used for slightly larger animals, serving as a passive hunting method that kept human risk to an absolute minimum while still yielding vital meat and fat. Ice fishing, northern tribes. In areas where lakes and rivers froze solid, ice fishing became a critical, low-risk hunt. Using bone chisels, holes were cut into the thick ice. Nets woven from nettle fibers or hooks made of bone were dropped into the frigid water. Spearing. Northern tribes like the Cree would sometimes use a spear, waiting motionless for hours over the hole, watching for the shadow of a trout or pike. This required immense physical stillness and mental focus, a demonstration of extreme endurance for a modest but necessary return of protein. The successful catch was dried or frozen immediately, ensuring a continuous supply of fish oil and protein throughout the winter. Part 7. The spiritual ecology of the hunts. Strategic winter hunt was successful because it was a holistic practice, where the spiritual and practical were inseparable. The success of the hunt was viewed as the result of a pact between humans and the natural world. Reciprocity and respect. The core spiritual tenet was reciprocity. The hunter believed that the animal willingly offered its life for the sustenance of the community. Therefore, disrespecting the animal's body or wasting any part of its sacrifice would violate the pact, leading to failed hunts and spiritual consequences. This belief system was the ultimate zero-waste doctrine, ensuring every hide, sinew, bone, and morsel of meat was utilized with reverence. The hunting songs and prayer. Hunters often sang hunting songs softly during the tracking phase or before the kill. These were not war chants, but quiet prayers, a form of meditation that focused the mind, conserved breath, and asked the animal's spirit to reveal itself. The song's rhythm acted as a psychological tool, calming the hunter's nerves and aligning their intent with the landscape. The post-hunt feast and redistribution. The culmination of the hunt was the post-hunt feast and the communal redistribution of the kill. The successful hunter was not the owner of the meat. The kill belonged to the community. The carcass was immediately divided according to established tribal protocols, ensuring that the elderly, the sick, and those who had been unsuccessful in the hunt received portions first. This communal sharing was the final, non-negotiable step in the strategic hunt, reinforcing the bonds of reliance and ensuring that the survival of the individual was always secondary to the survival of the tribe. The feast was a ceremony of thanksgiving, turning the life of the animal into the enduring life of the people. Part 8. The adaptive technology, footwear and gear. The success of the strategic winter hunt hinged on the hunter's ability to remain warm, dry and mobile for extended periods. The clothing and specialized gear were, in effect, extensions of the hunter's survival strategy. The engineered foot, layered moccasins and liners. The hunter's feet were the most vulnerable asset. The indigenous solution was a precise layered system to defeat conductive heat loss and moisture. Inner layer, moccasin. A soft, small moccasin made of supple hide. Insulation, grass fur. The critical air trap, dried prairie grass, cattail fluff, or rabbit fur packed between the inner and outer layers. This material was checked and replaced daily to ensure absolute dryness. Outer layer, moccasin. A heavier, treated hide moccasin, often high around the ankle, to seal the entire system. Leggings, jot wraps. External hide leggings or wraps tied over the outer moccasin to prevent deep snow from entering the boot, maintaining the integrity of the dry insulation. The fat barrier, skin protection as medicine. Before the hunt, exposed skin was coated with rendered bear grease or buffalo tallow, often mixed with ochre or ash. This was a vital medical and strategic defense. Protection. It created a waterproof, windproof barrier on the face and wrists, preventing frostbite. Camouflage. The darker tone of the mixture also reduced the glare reflected off the skin, blending the hunter's features against the environment and the sun's reflection on the snow. The portable fire kit. A small, personal fire kit was carried in a small, waterproof rawhide pouch, often suspended around the neck or kept close to the body. This ensured that the materials, dry tinder, bow drill components and flint, remained dry and warm, allowing the hunter to start a life-saving fire for warmth or emergency signaling, even if separated from the main party. The ability to generate heat instantly was the final strategic hedge against a sudden drop in temperature. Part 9. The Arctic's unique logistical hunt, Inuit detail. The Inuit winter hunt presented logistical challenges that demanded specific, non-replicable solutions due to the utter absence of wood and the constant threat of shifting, dangerous ice. The sled and navigation. The primary transport tool was the kamutiek sled, often built with runners made of frozen fish, bone, or even rolled wet hides, which were then frozen solid and smoothed with water to create an icy, fast surface. Dogs. The sleds were pulled by teams of specialized dogs, whose endurance and knowledge of the terrain were irreplaceable. Ice readability. Inuit hunters were masters of ice ecology, reading the texture, color, and sound of the sea ice to distinguish safe, stable platforms from lethal, thin spots that could give way to the freezing water below. Their ability to predict the movement of the ice was a critical, life-saving logistical skill. The hunting for light, blubber. The seal and whale hunt was not just a pursuit of food and fat for warmth. It was a pursuit of light. The blubber, fat, rendered into oil, was the fuel for the kudlik, seal oil lamp, inside the igloo, which provided the only light and supplemental heat. The successful hunt thus ensured the community had the energy to eat and the light to work, turning the kill into a direct input for the maintenance of the shelter and all subsequent domestic activities. Part 10. The legacy of the strategic hunt. The strategic winter hunt of Native Americans was a triumph of engineering, biology, and spirit. It was a perfectly integrated system that recognized the limitations of the human body and the limitless power of organized, respectful cooperation. They survived and thrived in a world that demanded their absolute best, leaving a legacy of survival wisdom that continues to instruct us today. The meticulous planning, the ingenuity of their tools, the spiritual pact with the animal, and the unwavering commitment to the collective good turned the silent, frozen landscape into a fertile ground for enduring life. Their hunt was an art form, a science, and a final, enduring testament to the resilience of the human spirit in harmony with the natural world. Part 11. The psychology of stillness, the hunter's endurance. The strategic winter hunt was as much a psychological battle as a physical one. Native American hunters developed profound methods to achieve the mental stillness necessary for long hours of cold, isolated waiting. The power of stillness, the Arctic wait. For the Inuit hunter waiting by the igloo, seal breathing hole, stillness was life. Any unnecessary movement or sound would alert the seal, ruining the hunt. The hunter cultivated a state of extreme meditation, conserving every calorie of heat by minimizing physical activity. This stillness was facilitated by specialized clothing, layered, lightweight, and perfectly insulating caribou hide clothing, which allowed the hunter to remain motionless for hours without the need for shivering, which would betray their position and rapidly consume energy reserves. The enduring stare, plains. On the plains, the hunter, tracking a herd across an open, freezing landscape, needed immense mental fortitude against the monotony, and the cold's creeping effects. Their training included practices that fostered extreme endurance, pushing the limits of physical and mental discomfort. The ability to endure the biting wind, the reflection of the sun on the snow, and the numbing fatigue was a prerequisite for the hunt. The spiritual belief that the animal was testing the hunter's worthiness acted as a psychological driver, turning physical discomfort into a spiritual trial that reinforced perseverance. The breathing technique, calorie conservation. Hunters across all regions practiced highly controlled, slow breathing techniques, a form of conscious calorie conservation. Rapid, heavy breathing expends energy and increases exposure to the frigid air, leading to dehydration and internal chilling. By practicing slow, shallow breathing through the nose, often protected by a light fur face covering, the hunter minimized energy loss and helped pre-warm the air before it reached the lungs. This was a non-verbal, physiological mastery of the environment. Part 12. The hunt as a shared narrative. The women's vital role. The success of the winter hunt was often narrated as a solitary act, but it was profoundly dependent on the organized, complementary labor of the women who managed the logistics and processing. The logistics of the processing camp. When a massive kill occurred, like a buffalo jump, the hunting party was quickly joined by the women and children of the community. Their role was a masterpiece of industrial efficiency. They arrived with the necessary tools, bone knives, sinew, portable drying racks, travois, and immediately established a temporary processing camp on the kill site. Speed and time. The women worked with astonishing speed to butcher and process the entire carcass before the deep cold fully set the meat, making cutting difficult. Speed was not just efficiency, it was a race against the elements to maximize the edible harvest. The tanning priority. Immediately after butchering, the hides were processed. If the hides were left to freeze and thaw improperly, they could be ruined. The initial phase of tanning, scraping, cleaning, was often done at the kill site to ensure the highest quality materials for the vital teepee covers and winter robes. The skill of preservation, the calorie engineers. The women were the true calorie engineers of the winter survival system. Their skill in creating pemmican, the perfect blend of protein, fat, and carbohydrate, berries, was the difference between life and death. They understood the science of drying and preservation, how thin to cut the meat, how hot to render the fat, and the exact ratio needed for maximum nutritional and storage efficiency. The long-term security of the tribe rested in the knowledge held in their hands. Part 13. Specialized trapping, the small game network. While large hunts were dramatic, a subtle, widespread network of small traps and snares provided the critical, daily sustenance that kept the community's core fed without high-risk expeditions. The squirrel and rabbit snare, ubiquitous. The simplest and most common trap was the sinew snare set for rabbits, squirrels, and grouse. These snares were placed along well-worn animal runs, often concealed under a light dusting of snow or brush. The trap line was typically managed by the youth or the elderly, providing them with a low-risk, essential contribution to the food supply and conserving the energy of the main hunters. The fish weir and basket trap, coastal river tribes. Even when rivers were partially frozen, tribes used ingenious traps to catch migrating or schooling fish. Weirs. In moving water, a weir, a fence-like structure of woven branches, was built across a shallow part of the river to funnel fish into a small, enclosed area. Basket traps. Large, conical basket traps, woven from willow or supple saplings, were placed at the narrow end of the weir. The fish could easily swim into the trap, but could not find their way out, providing a continuous, passive harvest during the transitional freeze. The ice decoy, Inuit, for ice fishing. The Inuit sometimes used a carved bone or ivory decoy, shaped like a fish, on a sinew line. Lowered into the clear water beneath the ice hole, the movement of the decoy attracted larger predatory fish, like pike or Arctic char, closer to the surface, bringing them into range of the spear. This small piece of technology utilized the predator's instinct against it, maximizing the efficiency of the long, cold wait. Part 14. The hunt's medical kit, healing in the field. The hunter's pouch was also a portable pharmacy. ensuring that injuries sustained in the field, a severe risk far from the main lodge, could be immediately treated. Yarrow, the blood stopper. Hunters always carried dried, pulverized yarrow leaves. Yarrow contains natural coagulants, and in the event of a deep cut or injury from a fall on ice or a struggle with an animal, the powder was immediately applied to the wound to help staunch the flow of blood. This was the first, most vital medical response. Bear grease for frostbite, small. Tightly sealed pouches of bear grease were carried to be immediately applied to any area showing the first signs of frostbite. Numbness, waxy-looking skin. The grease, warmed by body heat, was rubbed gently onto the area to restore circulation and prevent the rapid, damaging rethaw, which could lead to severe tissue loss. Sinew for sutures. The fine sinew used for sewing hides was also the primary material for field sutures. A hunter could use a sharp bone needle and sinew to close a deep, severe laceration, a brutal but necessary surgical intervention to prevent massive infection and further blood loss, allowing them to make the journey back to the main camp for recovery. Part 15. The legacy of endurance and respect. Strategic winter hunt was the ultimate test of the Native American ethos, a demonstration of the fusion of spiritual respect, organizational planning, and physical endurance. The lessons gleaned from this crucible remain profound. Respect for the land's rhythms. The success of the hunt was dependent on an absolute respect for the land's cycles. The people knew when to hunt hard to secure the main stores, and when to rest to conserve resources. They hunted efficiently to ensure the herd survived and regenerated, embodying a sustainable practice that viewed the animal population not as a limitless resource, but as a valued partner in the web of life. The hunter's humility. The spiritual dimension of the hunt, the act of asking for the animal's sacrifice, fostered a necessary humility. The hunter was not the master of nature, but a participant. This humility ensured that the hunting party remained meticulous, prepared, and never arrogant, recognizing that the cold could claim anyone who underestimated its power. The strategic winter hunt was, in its entirety, a masterpiece of human adaptation, a brilliant, coordinated effort that transformed a season of potential death into a period of profound life, cultural reinforcement, and collective strength. The knowledge of how to read the silent language of the snow, how to engineer a tool from bone, and how to honor the spirit of the kill ensured that the warm heart of the community continued to beat, strong and true, until the sun brought life back to the land. Part 16. The art of decoy and lure hunting in the extreme cold, where human scent and movement were immediate alerts. Specialized decoys and lures were used to draw animals into striking range, conserving the hunter's energy and maximizing the success rate. The caller and lure, Northeast Great Lakes. Hunters seeking moose or deer often used simple sound-based decoys. In late fall or early winter, before the deepest freeze, the bull moose could still be highly territorial. A hunter would use a piece of birch bark or a bone scraper to mimic the sound of a bull raking its antlers on a tree or the sound of a mating call. The sound traveled far in the still, cold air, drawing the territorial animal closer to the hunter's concealed position. This technique required exceptional acoustic realism and precise knowledge of the animal's psychological state. The camouflage and disguise, plains. On the open plains, where concealment was minimal, hunters used full-body camouflage. Before the communal buffalo jump, the stalkers used buffalo robes and hides, often with the head still attached, to disguise themselves as members of the herd or as harmless wolves. By imitating the animal's behavior, grazing, resting, or slowly approaching, the hunters could infiltrate the perimeter of the herd without triggering panic. This was a psychological hunt, relying on the animal's lack of suspicion to achieve critical proximity. The wolf's example, the stalk. The hunter often studied the wolf, the buffalo's natural predator, for stalking techniques. The wolf hunts in packs, singles out the weak, and uses the landscape for concealment. The hunter emulated this patience and coordination, learning to use the slightest rise, the smallest thicket, or the changing wind direction to slowly, methodically close the gap. The successful winter hunt was often a collaboration with the silent lessons taught by the wolf. Part 17. The architecture of the ambush. pits and barriers beyond the great cliffs of the Buffalo Jump. Native Americans engineered the landscape itself into traps, turning subtle geographical features into massive, passive hunting tools. The snowdrift ambush. Hunters learned to recognize how snowdrifts formed around natural barriers, ridges, coulees, riverbanks. These deep, often deceptively soft drifts were used as natural traps. They would drive game toward the edge of these deep snow pockets, knowing that the heavy animal would flounder and become immobilized in the powder, while the hunter, on snowshoes, retained mobility and a lethal advantage. The fences and corrals. Plains Plateau. For slightly smaller game like antelope or sometimes deer, communities built temporary drive fences, long lines of low brush, rocks or posts that funneled the animals toward a single, concealed pit trap or a small enclosed corral. These fences were built subtly, designed to look like natural obstacles that the animals would instinctively avoid crossing, forcing them down the desired path toward the ambush point. This required immense planning and communal labor, but conserved energy during the final, critical chase. The river crossing trap. When rivers or large lakes froze, hunters knew where the ice was thin or where moving water created open leads. They would strategically drive herds toward these weak points. The herd, fearful of the unstable ice, would be forced into a concentrated area where hunters waited, or the ice would break beneath them, immobilizing them in the freezing water. This high-risk technique was sometimes used in dire situations, capitalizing on the terrain's dangers. Part 18. The hunter's body. Biothermal management. The hunter's most immediate task was managing his own body temperature and energy expenditure. The clothing and field practices were sophisticated systems of biothermal management. Sweat is death, the layering principle. The hunter understood that sweat, which causes evaporative cooling, was a swift path to hypothermia in freezing weather. The layered clothing system, soft inner hides, thick fur mid-layers, windproof outer hides, was designed to be easily adjustable. When exerting energy, climbing, chasing, layers were opened or partially removed immediately to prevent sweating. When resting, layers were immediately closed and tightened to trap the residual body heat. This continuous conscious adjustment was critical to survival. The pulse point guard. Vital to maintaining core temperature was protecting the major arteries close to the skin. The hunter wore specialized fur wraps or small hide bands around the wrists, neck, and ankles. These pulse point guards minimized heat loss from the rapidly circulating blood, ensuring that warm blood reached the hands and feet, the most vulnerable extremities, for as long as possible. The material, often fat-treated hide, was chosen to be flexible and non-constricting. The emergency fat ration, a small, hardened lump of tallow or pemmican, was often carried in an inner pocket close to the body. This was not for a meal, but for an immediate emergency caloric boost. Chewing this dense fat released high-octane energy directly into the system, providing the rapid fuel needed to initiate shivering and restart the body's internal heat generation during an unexpected exposure. Part 19. The communication of the hunt. Signals and signs. Successful. Communal hunting required non-verbal, long-distance communication that transcended the noise of the wind and the vastness of the landscape. Smoke signals. Plains Plateau. Hunters used precisely controlled smoke signals for long-distance communication with the camp or with other hunting parties. By building a small fire and smothering it with wet grass or green wood, they created a dark, dense column of smoke. The rhythm of the signal, short puffs or long columns, was a coded language conveying information like "kill successful," "need aid," or "herd sighted in this direction." Fire light signals, night. For night hunting or signaling, hunters sometimes use flaming arrows shot high into the air, or small, rapid bursts of fire on a high ridge. The flash of light, visible for miles across the open plains, could signal a change in strategy or confirm the location of the camp to a lost hunter. Ground markers, the silent map. Hunting parties left subtle, coded ground markers for groups following them. These might include cairns, small piles of stones indicating a general direction. Snapped branches, a specific pattern of broken or tied branches signaling the size and type of game found, or a danger ahead. The moccasin mark, a deliberately exaggerated or uniquely marked footprint in the snow, confirming the passing of the specific hunting party. Part 20. The hunter's story, cultural preservation. The winter hunt, even before the post-hunt feast, served as a massive cultural and educational endeavor, ensuring the continuity of the tribe's knowledge. The training ground. Boys, and often girls, learned the skills of tracking and field processing from a very young age. Boys would accompany the hunting parties, observing the silent language of the men, learning how to read the tracks, how to approach the animal, and how to stay downwind. This real-world apprenticeship was the only form of schooling for the survival trade. The post-hunt debrief, elders' wisdom. When the successful hunters returned, the story of the hunt was recounted in detail in the warmth of the lodge. The elders listened intently, analyzing the strategy, pointing out successful moves, and critically evaluating mistakes. This storytelling was a vital educational forum, preserving the collective tactical wisdom and ensuring that the hard-won lessons of the hunt were immediately transferred to the younger generation. The narrative was, in essence, a living, oral textbook on survival strategy. The hide as historical record. The tanned hides from the successful kill were often used as canvases for pictographic histories, the winter counts. These were painted records of the year's major events, often focusing on the most successful or dramatic hunts. The hide literally became a historical document, ensuring the memory of the strategic success was preserved for all future generations to study and honor. Part 21. The final act of respect. The unseen hunter. The Native American hunter operated within a specific moral and environmental code, often seeking to take only what was needed and showing respect not just to the dead, but to the living herd. Targeting and selection. A skilled hunter did not kill indiscriminately. They often targeted older, sick, or weaker animals that were less likely to survive the winter anyway, ensuring the health and strength of the remaining breeding herd. This practice was a form of primitive wildlife management, driven by a long-term understanding that the survival of the people depended on the health of the animals. The sacred pipe and the offering. Before a communal hunt, and sometimes after a kill, the sacred pipe might be smoked. The smoke, carrying the prayers of the people, was offered to the four directions and to the spirit of the animal. This was the most solemn acknowledgement of the life taken, affirming the reciprocal relationship between the people and the natural world. The smoke was the medicine that ensured the pact of life continued. Conservation of the resource. If the hunt was successful and the caches were full, the hunters would intentionally reduce their activity or shift their focus to smaller, more sustainable resources like trapping. This conscious conservation of the resource was the highest ethical standard of the strategic hunt, prioritizing the long-term vitality of the herd over immediate consumption. The winter hunt was a continuous balance between necessity and reverence. Part 22. The adaptability of the hunt. A continuous evolution. The indigenous hunting strategy was never static. It was a continuous, adaptive evolution based on observed environmental changes and the influence of new materials. Integration of new tools, horses. The introduction of the horse by Europeans dramatically altered the plains hunt, turning the chase into a faster, more effective pursuit. The strategy quickly adapted. The emphasis shifted from the difficult, energy-intensive footstalk to coordinated horseback drives, allowing hunters to target specific animals and manage the herd with greater precision. This was a tactical evolution that utilized new technology within the existing framework of communal organization and zero-waste processing. Shifting hunting grounds. In response to climate shifts or encroachment from other groups, hunting parties constantly sought new, more reliable territories. The scouting for new game trails and sheltered grazing areas in the fall was a crucial strategic role, often given to the most experienced and trusted elders who had the mental maps and ecological memory of generations. The hunt was thus tied directly to the intelligence of the scouts and the adaptability of the entire tribe's geographical knowledge. The strategic winter hunt was the ultimate indigenous survival system, a fusion of rigorous planning, ecological science, spiritual humility, and communal organization. It ensured not just the survival of the individual hunter, but the flourishing of the entire people through the deepest cold. Part 23. The geometry of concealment, blending with the freeze. The ability to successfully approach large game in an open, frozen landscape depended entirely on the hunter's capacity to disappear into the environment, making the geometry of concealment a high-level strategic art form. Using terrain and silhouette. Hunters instinctively used the terrain to break their silhouette. They would always approach the prey by keeping to the low spots, coulees, dry creek beds, or by aligning their bodies with vertical elements like trees or large rocks. They learned never to cross a skyline, as even a brief exposure against the bright white snow or pale sky would alert the keen eyes of a buffalo or moose miles away. The stalk was a continuous fluid movement, keeping the hunter's body mass visually integrated with the natural lines of the landscape. The snow crawl technique. In open fields with minimal cover, the hunter resorted to the snow crawl, utilizing the disguise of a hide, dressed in white or pale hides and moving extremely slowly, sometimes taking several hours to cover a few hundred yards. They mimicked the slow, non-threatening movement of a resting animal or a cautious predator. This technique required immense patience and stamina, as the hunter had to maintain body heat while remaining in continuous, low contact with the freezing ground. Wind and dust camouflage. Southwest. In the arid Southwest, Apache, Navajo, where winter snows were minimal but the air was cold and dry, hunters used the landscape's colors. They utilized camo painting, mixing dark charcoal or desert ochre with fat and applying it to their skin and light-colored hides. This broke up the human shape against the scrub brush and rocky terrain, maximizing concealment in an environment where natural cover was sparse. The disguise was a strategic defense against the prey's superior eyesight. Part 24. The logistics of shared meat. From field to feast, the successful kill initiated a complex, rapid logistical process that was the true measure of the tribe's organizational capacity. The movement of the meat from the frozen field back to the warm camp was a critical challenge. The women's logistical role. Women and older children quickly mobilized to the kill site with their travois and rawhide carrying bags, parfleches. The hide bags, made tough and waterproof, were essential for carrying the high-fat, high-value portions back to the camp for immediate preservation. Weight management. The butchering was often done with a focus on manageable weight. The animal was divided into sections, quarters, rib cages, internal organs, that could be easily loaded onto the travois or carried by individuals, maximizing the efficiency of the return journey. The insulating layer. The thick, untanned hide of the animal was often placed over the processed meat on the travois. This was not just a covering, it was a layer of insulation, protecting the meat from being damaged by freezing and thawing cycles, and preventing it from becoming contaminated by snow or dirt during transport. The camp's readiness. The main camp, upon receiving a signal of success, immediately prepared for the incoming bounty. Fires were built higher, drying racks were erected, and processing tools were made ready. This communal preemptive action ensured that no time was wasted upon the hunter's return, allowing the critical work of preservation to begin instantly. The efficiency of the camp in receiving the kill was as important as the hunter's skill in making it. Part 25. The ethical and spiritual dimensions of the kill. Strategic hunt was defined by a profound ethical code that governed the relationship between the hunter and the hunted. A code that was enforced by spiritual belief. The concept of the willing sacrifice. Many tribes believed that the animal's life was a gift, a willing sacrifice offered to the people. The hunter's job was to prove worthy of that sacrifice through skill, respect, and utilization. This belief meant that the kill had to be clean and quick, minimizing the animal's suffering. A botched or wasteful kill was not only a logistical error, it was a grave spiritual transgression that could anger the animal's spirit, leading to future bad luck or failure in the hunt. The ritual of the heart touch a life source. In some tribes, a small, highly significant ritual was performed immediately after the kill, often involving the animal's heart or a piece of its internal organ. A small portion might be left on the ground as an offering to the earth or the animal's spirit. an acknowledgement that the life force was returning to the natural cycle. This simple act reinforced the spiritual contract that made the hunt permissible. The zero waste mandate. The zero waste philosophy, where every part of the animal was used, meat, fat, organs, bone, sinew, hide, hair, was the ultimate act of ethical respect. It was a daily practical demonstration that the animal's gift was taken with maximum reverence and responsibility. Part 26. The tools of mobility. Snowshoes and skis in. Snow-rich environments. Specialized footwear was the most critical technological advantage, transforming the challenge of deep snow into an asset. The snowshoe geometry. Northeast. The snowshoe was a marvel of engineered flotation. The wide ovular frame, often hickory or ash, was laced with rawhide netting, distributing the wearer's weight across a massive surface area. This lowered the ground pressure of the hunter to a fraction of the animal's, allowing the hunter to walk virtually on top of the deep powder while the moose or deer sank deep, becoming exhausted and vulnerable. Different geometries were developed for different terrains. A long, narrow snowshoe for dense forest trails, and a shorter, wider one for open powder. Primitive skis, northern tribes. Some northern tribes, particularly those influenced by Siberian contact, utilize primitive skis, long, narrow strips of wood lined with animal fur, often sealskin, on the underside. The fur was oriented to allow the ski to glide forward smoothly, but resist sliding backward, enabling the hunter to cover vast distances at speed with minimal energy expenditure. This was a strategic tool for rapid scouting and long-distance tracking in high-mobility warfare. The moccasin as snow tool. Even the standard moccasin was adapted. The high ankle cut and the ability to tightly cinch the top prevented snow from falling inside the boot, a small detail that prevented the insulation, grass fur, from becoming wet and useless. The design was a continuous thermal defense system. Part 27. The legacy of the strategic hunt in modern life. The strategic winter hunt leaves a legacy that extends beyond history, informing modern principles of sustainability, logistics, and resource management. The principle of sustainable harvesting. The indigenous hunting ethos, taking only what is needed, focusing on herd health, and utilizing every part, is now the foundation of modern sustainable agriculture and wildlife conservation. It is a powerful lesson in valuing the resource's life cycle over short-term profit. Logistical efficiency, the organizational genius of the kill site processing, the immediate field dressing, the standardized cuts, the specialized travois transport, is a model of rapid, decentralized logistics. It demonstrates how highly trained, specialized teams can maximize resource recovery under extreme environmental pressure. Biothermal wisdom. The hunter's knowledge of layering, breathing techniques, and pulse point protection is the basis of modern cold weather survival training. The wisdom of sweat is death, and the use of fat as a protective barrier are recognized medical truths applied by modern military and expedition teams operating in extreme cold. The strategic winter hunt of Native Americans was a perfect synthesis of practical knowledge, technological ingenuity, and a spiritual code of conduct. It was a necessary, beautiful, and enduring act of life preservation against the ultimate adversary of the North American continent. Part 28. The science of icing. Tools for the Arctic and water. The strategic hunt involved the deliberate use of ice and frozen water, not just as terrain, but as a component of the hunting technology itself, especially in the Arctic and areas near frozen rivers. Icing the runners, Inuit and northern tribes. The speed and efficiency of the Kamatik, Inuit sled, were enhanced by a meticulous process of icing the runners. The runners, often made of bone, antler, or sometimes a temporary material like frozen hide rolls, were deliberately coated with water and allowed to freeze into a smooth, thick layer of ice. This created a perfectly low-friction surface that allowed the sled, even under immense weight, such as a seal or caribou carcass, to glide easily over the snow and rough ice terrain, conserving the energy of the dog team and the hunters. The maintenance of this icy surface was a daily ritual. The ice axe and probe, safety and extraction. In conditions where the thickness of the ice was uncertain, The hunter carried a specialized ice axe or probe, often made of antler or a long sharp piece of bone. This tool was used constantly to tap and test the ice ahead, listening for the deep, solid thud that indicated stability, or the hollow crack that signaled danger. This tool was a non-negotiable safety mechanism, preventing the hunter from falling into the lethal open water, which would result in immediate hypothermia and death. The frozen harpoon line. For sea mammal hunting, seal, walrus, the harpoon line, often rawhide, was critical. It was kept meticulously coiled and dry, often stored inside the hunter's protective clothing or in a small, insulated pouch. If the line became wet and froze, it would be impossible to pay out quickly when the animal was struck, leading to the loss of the kill. The strategic hunt dictated that the line remained supple, even when everything else around it was frozen solid. Part 29. The psychological warfare of the hunt, mind over mammal. The hunter often relied on psychological tactics to break the prey's natural defenses, exploiting its fear, curiosity, or herd instinct to bring it into a manageable position. The use of noise and silence. Noise. In communal drives, like the buffalo jump, explosive, sudden noise, shouts, fire, drumming on hides, was used to break the animal's cognitive process, pushing it from a state of caution into panic, stampede. Silence. In stalking, moose, elk, the approach was one of absolute suffocating silence. The hunter cultivated the ability to move without the smallest sound, using the quiet of the snow and the stillness of the air to their advantage, relying on the prey's own fear of the unknown to hold it motionless. The curiosity lure, antelope, deer. For naturally curious animals like the antelope, hunters sometimes used a simple visual lure. A hunter might lie flat in the open snow and raise a piece of hide or a bright cloth on a stick, waving it gently. The antelope's overwhelming curiosity would often draw it closer to investigate the strange, non-threatening object, bringing it into range of the concealed archer. This strategic exploitation of animal psychology was a classic low-energy ambush. The decoy's trust, plains. The use of the wolf or calf hide disguise was an act of profound psychological warfare. By appearing non-threatening, calf, or a part of the natural background, wolf, the hunter gained the animal's trust, allowing them to penetrate the herd's defense perimeter. The successful disguise relied not just on the costume, but on the hunter, mimicking the animal's movement and posture perfectly. Part 30. The Hunter's Code. Rules of engagement. The strategic winter hunt was governed by an unwritten, yet strictly observed, set of rules that prioritized community stability and future resource availability over immediate personal gain. The rule of the first arrow sunron strike. In many communal hunts, the ownership of the kill was determined by the first strike, the arrow or spear that initially wounded or brought down the animal. However, the subsequent division of the meat was always communal. This rule ensured that hunters did not argue or compete over a kill, minimizing conflict in a high-stress environment and upholding the social code of the hunt. The prohibition on waste. The law against wasting any part of the kill was absolute. This was enforced not just by elders, but by the entire social structure. Any hunter seen wasting blood, usable bone or muscle tissue could face social ostracization or spiritual penalties. This strict mandate was the core of the zero-waste survival economy. The call for aid. If a hunter was successful but faced a challenge that exceeded their strength, such as an unexpectedly large animal, a severe wound, or a sudden change in weather, they were expected to use a prearranged signal, a specific call, a smoke pattern, to summon aid. The nearest hunters or camp members were obligated to respond immediately, reinforcing the principle that the survival of the resource and the safety of the hunter were communal responsibilities. Part 31. The architecture of the field camp, heat and processing when. The hunting party was forced to spend multiple days away from the main camp. The construction of an effective temporary shelter became an extension of the hunting strategy, conserving the hunter's energy and protecting the harvested meat. The snow wall windbreak. The immediate priority was the construction of a snow wall windbreak. Hunters would use pieces of wood or their bone shovels to rapidly pile up a low, thick wall of snow on the windward side of their shelter or fire pit. This wall immediately reduced the wind chill, making a small fire viable and allowing the hunters to dry damp clothes and begin immediate processing of the kill. The field tepi, wickiup. For a multi-day camp, hunters would erect a minimalist structure, a small, quick-build conical frame of available brush, often covered with extra hides or pine boughs carried for this purpose. This temporary teepee, or wickiup, was primarily designed to cut the wind and trap a small amount of body heat, providing enough warmth for essential rest and meticulous work. Protecting the meat cache. Harvested meat had to be protected from scavengers, wolves, wolverines, and the elements. The hunters would often hide the meat in a temporary snow cache, a pile of meat covered thickly with snow and sometimes weighed down with heavy stones. The snow kept the temperature stable, preventing excessive thawing, harm freezing, and provided camouflage, ensuring the kill was safe until the main party could retrieve it. Part 32. The final endurance. The return journey. The return trip was often the most physically taxing phase, requiring specialized knowledge to defeat the cumulative effects of cold and exhaustion. The pacing and caloric management. Hunters learned to pace themselves, recognizing that a sudden burst of speed to get home faster could lead to catastrophic exhaustion and subsequent hypothermia. They maintained a steady, energy-efficient pace. Small, intermittent consumption of pemmican and bone broth, carried in insulated pouches, provided steady caloric input to keep the core temperature stable. The vigilance against the whiteout. The return trip was often undertaken in deteriorating weather. Hunters relied heavily on their celestial and geographical knowledge, constantly checking their bearing against the sun, moon, or familiar peaks. If a full whiteout struck, the strategic decision was often to stop immediately, construct an emergency shelter, and wait out the storm, recognizing that continued travel in zero visibility was an unacceptably high risk. The strategic winter hunt was thus a comprehensive, multi-layered system that began with a spiritual pact and ended with a logistical triumph, ensuring that the necessary life of the animal was translated completely and respectfully into the enduring life of the people. Part 33. The science of icing. Tools for the Arctic and water. The strategic hunt involved the deliberate use of ice and frozen water, not just as terrain, but as a component of the hunting technology itself, especially in the Arctic and areas near frozen rivers. Icing the runners, Inuit northern tribes. The speed and efficiency of the kamutik, Inuit sled, were enhanced by a meticulous process of icing the runners. The runners, often made of bone, antler, or sometimes a temporary material like frozen hide rolls, were deliberately coated with water and allowed to freeze into a smooth, thick layer of ice. This created a perfectly low-friction surface that allowed the sled, even under immense weight, such as a seal or caribou carcass, to glide easily over the snow and rough ice terrain, conserving the energy of the dog team and the hunters. The maintenance of this icy surface was a daily ritual, sometimes involving applying a fresh coat of water or saliva in a pinch and smoothing it with a piece of bone. The ice axe and probe, safety and extraction. In conditions where the thickness of the ice was uncertain, the hunter carried a specialized ice axe or probe, often made of antler or a long sharp piece of bone. This tool was used constantly to tap and test the ice ahead, listening for the deep solid thud that indicated stability or the hollow crack that signaled danger. This tool was a non-negotiable safety mechanism, preventing the hunter from falling into the lethal open water, which would result in immediate hypothermia and death. Furthermore, this tool was essential for testing the aglu, seal breathing hole, to ensure it was actively being used by a seal before committing to the long, motionless wait. The frozen harpoon line. For sea mammal hunting, seal, walrus. The harpoon line, often rawhide, was critical. It was kept meticulously coiled and dry, often stored inside the hunter's protective clothing or in a small insulated pouch. If the line became wet and froze, it would be impossible to pay out quickly when the animal was struck, leading to the loss of the kill. The strategic hunt dictated that the line remained supple, even when everything else around it was frozen solid. Part 34. The psychological warfare of the hunt. Mind over mammal. The hunter often relied on psychological tactics to break the prey's natural defenses, exploiting its fear, curiosity, or herd instinct to bring it into a manageable position. The use of noise and silence. Noise, in communal drives, like the buffalo jump, explosive, sudden noise, shouts, fire, drumming on hides, was used to break the animal's cognitive process, pushing it from a state of caution into panic, stampede. The sudden shock overrode the animal's survival instinct, compelling it forward. Silence. In stalking, moose, elk, the approach was one of absolute suffocating silence. The hunter cultivated the ability to move without the smallest sound, using the quiet of the snow and the stillness of the air to their advantage, relying on the prey's own fear of the unknown to hold it motionless. The curiosity lure. Antelope, deer. For naturally curious animals like the antelope, hunters sometimes used a simple visual lure. A hunter might lie flat in the open snow and raise a piece of hide or a bright cloth on a stick, waving it gently. The antelope's overwhelming curiosity would often draw it closer to investigate the strange, non-threatening object, bringing it into range of the concealed archer. This strategic exploitation of animal psychology was a classic low-energy ambush, relying on the prey's instincts overriding its fear. The decoy's trust, plains. The use of the wolf or calf hide disguise was an act of profound psychological warfare. By appearing non-threatening, calf, or a part of the natural background, wolf, the hunter gained the animal's trust, allowing them to penetrate the perimeter of the herd without triggering a massive flight response. The successful disguise relied not just on the costume, but on the hunter mimicking the animal's movement and posture perfectly, becoming an actor on the stage of the frozen prairie. Part 35. The Hunter's Code. Rules of Engagement. The strategic winter hunt was governed by an unwritten, yet strictly observed, set of rules that prioritized community stability and future resource availability over immediate personal gain. The rule of the first arrow, strike. In many communal hunts, the ownership of the kill was determined by the first strike, the arrow or spear that initially wounded or brought down the animal. This rule was vital to preventing disputes during the highly stressful event. However, the subsequent division of the meat was always communal, based on need, not the hunter's individual success. This dual system upheld individual honor while reinforcing collective responsibility. The prohibition on waste. The law against wasting any part of the kill was absolute. This was enforced not just by elders, but by the entire social structure. Any hunter seen wasting blood, usable bone, or muscle tissue could face social ostracization or severe spiritual penalties. This strict mandate was the core of the zero-waste survival economy, where resourcefulness was a moral virtue. The call for aid. If a hunter was successful but faced a challenge that exceeded their strength, such as an unexpectedly large animal, a severe wound, or a sudden change in weather, they were expected to use a prearranged signal, a specific call, a smoke pattern to summon aid. The nearest hunters or camp members were obligated to respond immediately, reinforcing the principle that the survival of the resource and the safety of the hunter were communal responsibilities, outweighing any personal task. Part 36. The architecture of the field camp. Heat and processing. When the hunting party was forced to spend multiple days away from the main camp, the construction of an effective temporary shelter became an extension of the hunting strategy, conserving the hunter's energy and protecting the harvested meat. The snow wall windbreak. The immediate priority was the construction of a snow wall windbreak. Hunters would use pieces of wood or their bone shovels to rapidly pile up a low, thick wall of snow on the windward side of their shelter or fire pit. This wall immediately reduced the wind chill, making a small fire viable and allowing the hunters to dry damp clothes and begin immediate processing of the kill. This conserved critical fuel that would otherwise be lost to the wind. The field tepi wickiup. For a multi-day camp, hunters would erect a minimalist structure, a small, quick-build conical frame of available brush, often covered with extra hides or pine boughs carried for this purpose. This temporary teepee or wickiup was primarily designed to cut the wind and trap a small amount of body heat providing enough warmth for essential rest and meticulous work. The bedding would be a simple layered platform of pine boughs and furs, maintaining the principle of breaking the cold chain even in an emergency setting, protecting the meat cache. Harvested meat had to be protected from scavengers, wolves, wolverines, and the elements. The hunters would often hide the meat in a temporary snow cache, a pile of meat covered thickly with snow, and sometimes weighed down with heavy stones. The snow kept the temperature stable, preventing excessive thawing, freezing, and provided camouflage, ensuring the kill was safe until the main party could retrieve it. In the Arctic, meat was often stored in massive outdoor caches, built of stone and topped with heavy stones to defeat polar bears and other massive scavengers. Part 37. The final endurance. The return journey, the Thai. Return trip was often the most physically taxing phase, requiring specialized knowledge to defeat the cumulative effects of cold and exhaustion. The pacing and caloric management. Hunters learned to pace themselves, recognizing that a sudden burst of speed to get home faster could lead to catastrophic exhaustion and subsequent hypothermia. They maintained a steady, energy-efficient pace. Small, intermittent consumption of pemmican and bone broth carried in insulated pouches provided steady caloric input to keep the core temperature stable. The high-fat content of the pemmican was designed specifically for this purpose: slow release, sustained heat generation.